You know, when my parents were young, they used to load us kids up in the car every summer and take off over the western states, camping out of the trunk of the car on a 1-month vacation, visiting our national parks and monuments. My father made sure that we were aware of our American heritage in our public lands. Painting the land is an honor and a privilege, which will take me my entire life to explore. My painting style, technique, and inspiration can be traced back to the School of 1830, otherwise known as the Barbizon School of French landscape painting. Now, the Barbizon School derived its name from the Barbizon village in northern France, where most of its school painters resided. This was a group of artists that was led by Theodore Rousseau. And they rejected the classical landscape style of the day, and they insisted upon direct study from nature, outdoors, on location, as their primary tenet or credo. They were part of a movement towards realism in art, which grew out of the Romantic period of the day. And I can break my process down for you in 4 basic steps. First and foremost is painting on location. This is where the inspiration happens. When I'm painting on location, the only thing that's important to me is color. I'm interested in how light is interacting with matter. And you know, there's really nothing intellectual about this painting on location process. It's an emotional response to nature. I'm doing a dance with nature's color. And I take pictures from the beginning, middle, and end of the session to document the changing light and dark patterns and to capture the surrounding details. And I use those photos back in the studio here in step number 2. Drawing and composition in charcoal and pencil. Composition meaning where within the context of the picture plane things are placed specifically, and value, that is to say how light and how dark things are without regard to color. Because remember, on location I was concerned primarily with color. Well, in this phase of my process, I've divorced myself from color. I'm only interested in how light and how dark things are on a black and white and gray scale, and where they're placed specifically within the context of the picture plane. Takes me anywhere from 3 to 5 to as many as 10 drawings to get a drawing that I'm really excited about and ready to paint. And I will at times employ topographical maps in the sketching process if the terrain is unusually complex, such as in the Grand Canyon, to get a better lay of the land and the distances involved. So when I'm done with that sketch, the black and white sketch in the studio, I grid the sketch with horizontal and vertical lines right on top of the drawing. Now, this grid system has been used by artists for probably 500 years or more as a means or a method of transferring drawings and paintings up to larger scale works proportionately. So once I have that drawing transferred up onto the intermediate canvas, this size here, and by the way, intermediate canvases for me can be anywhere from 18 by 24 inches all the way up to 48 by 60. That's an intermediate size for me. Once I have that drawing transferred up onto the intermediate canvas and I'm ready to begin painting, I pull that field sketch out that I did several weeks ago on location, remember. And here's where it becomes important, because I match my colors, color for color, all the colors that I saw that day while painting on location. So I'll whip up a little paint on the palette, put a dab right up on the field sketch. If it doesn't match, I'll wipe it off, adjust the tone on the palette, and put another dab up there until I have all the colors matched. Third step is the intermediate painting in oil. Now, oftentimes, this third step in my process becomes the final step. This is the third step here. Because let's face it, after all, you know, a 30-inch by 60-inch painting, as an example, is a good-sized painting. I would have expressed myself fully, and so I consider it a finished painting. So I'll sign it and varnish it, photograph it, document it, frame it, and get it out to a gallery, museum, or a show. But oftentimes, I feel like I've not been able to express enough detail, or the subject matter is so grandiose that I feel like I need to enlarge that intermediate painting up to a large-scale work of, say, 5 by 10 feet, or even 6 by 12 feet. You know, the famous British physicist, Lord Kelvin, after whom the absolute temperature scale was named, he once said in a lecture, "When you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind." Well, he was, of course, referring to the furtherance of science. The problem is, however, that art will never be a science, and yet science has been at the core of making art for hundreds of years. The number phi is a magical number. Has anybody ever heard of this number? Spelled P-H-I. Oh, good. Excellent. Well, Mario Livio, the astrophysicist, in his book, The Story of Phi, has referred to this number as the world's most astonishing number. Phi is a ratio which occurs in nature, and yes, it seems that nature has mysteriously selected this ratio as a means of inventing itself. It's more often referred to as the golden section or the divine proportion, as Leonardo da Vinci referred to it as. It's a specific ratio of 1 to 1.618. Or in layman's terms, 1 to a little more than 1.5. But specifically, mysteriously, nature's chosen 1 to 1.618. A few examples of this ratio would be the width of an egg to the height of an egg, 1 to 1.618. The relationship between the upper and lower leg, 1 to 1.618. The way in which a nautilus shell grows in its spiral, geometric, logarithmic pattern, based on the ratio of 1 to 1.618. So over and over and over again, we find this ratio in nature, in birds, trees, animals, plants, fish, nuts, shells, seeds, insects, flowers. So I figure if it's good enough for nature, it's good enough for me. And I use this ratio in my paintings. The question then arises, do I use numbers exclusively, rigidly, like a slave in my paintings, drawings, and compositions? As a matter of fact, I do not. I use the numbers, but I don't let them use me. If something needs moving around, I'll move it intuitively. This is where art and science diverge, and this is why art will never be a science. To try to do something intuitively, that's fun, that's fine. A lot of artists are real happy doing that. I tried a lot of, that kind of painting, abstract and just loosey type of painting, but the more I painted, the more I realized I needed to know more about the natural world to satisfy myself. It's not all about my emotions. I want something that's going to be universally perceived, the way we all perceive it. But I want you to partake. I want everybody to partake in my artwork. So that's why I'm interested in realism, painterly realism. That's why I'm interested in how we see the way we see. I want to apply those techniques and understanding scientifically how we see so that I can produce a painting that's universally acceptable. 4 or 5 colors is all I use. And with the addition of, once in a while, I'll pull in a little cadmiums, a little ultramarine blue in. But I basically work with Mars black and white. I work with Venetian red, which is an earth red, and a yellow ochre, which I don't have up here right now, but this is it right here, mixed with white. And it's called the Zorns, the Anders Zorn palette. So I work my pure colors around the outside of the palette, and there's nothing pure in nature unless it's flowers or man-made, something man-made. So then I use those pure colors and I pull them in, match my values using white to get a gray palette. Theodore Van Stollen, Taos artist, told you will never learn how to paint unless you can learn how to paint out of a gray palette, G-R-E-Y. Gray meaning mixtures of opposite colors, the complements. I placed the temple of Isis right on 0.618, okay? So I took 50 times 0.618, came out to about right here. And then the vertical side, the line came out. So the mass of the weight of the pyramid is sitting right about here on the golden section. The repoussoir, I placed it 1/3 across the distance. And then this is the temple of Cheops here. And it was constructed just the opposite. This is the golden section on this one. Oh. Okay, so the repoussoirs come in at 1/3 the distance from here to the end of the painting. Even though the lightest lights against the darkest darks are in here, the lines and the feeling and the flow is out here. Look at Isis, look at Isis. Isis is the star of the show. Even though she's quiet, she's just quietly sitting back in there in the shadows. I think your value relationship between here and here is right on. I wouldn't change that. So what I'm going to suggest is that these darks,
too dark.
They're a little dark for as far away as they are. And the darks, of course, the further away you are, the less dark they become as you march closer and closer and closer to the dark. And the less distinction there is between these values back here, the further back it's going to go, yeah. The closer you come to your viewpoint, the darker the interstices, or what we call the key darks, will be. Right up in the foreground, they're black. If you look real closely, if you stand outside, and they're black up close. Dark. That's why I do color studies. That's why I stand out there and paint on location, because I'm giving my direct impression of what the colors are and the relationships are in nature. And then when I come back here to the studio, I have a record of that, and I can match that. It's very difficult to come back in the studio and remember color. I find that if I use a gray palette and I mix my paints very carefully, mix your whole spectrum of grays, and just a little tiny touch of color. When I come down to the edge of this shadow, look at this. I don't know if you even perceived that before, but the difference between here and the edge of that shadow, here also, just a little bit more intense as I approach the edge of the light. And all of a sudden, the brain says, yeah, that's light bright, that's bright, it's really bright, but it's not. It's very gray, because I graduate from this right back to, 3 to 5% grayer and darker right back here. Do you see the difference?
Yeah.
It's a very subtle change, but it's very real. Well, the first thing that strikes me about it, of course, it's got a nice feeling. It's very genuine, it's very honest, and I love that about it. The first thing that strikes me, however, is you've got a barrier, a wall right here. It doesn't allow me to get in and go up into the mountain. And I also see this ground plane all of a sudden plummets off into the distance.
I was trying to do value, more and more value difference to bring your eye in here.
But it's not a problem of value. It's not a problem of value, it's a problem of linear perspective. I was working on a painting one time and all of a sudden this became apparent to me. That I had a chasm behind a row of trees that I didn't put there. I thought, oh my God, what? So I called Wilson up and I said, Wilson, I can't believe this. I put a precipice in my painting that I never intended to. And he said, well, are you busy right now? What are you doing? I said, well, I'm just painting. He said, I'll be down in about half an hour. So nice. He came down and he told me, okay. That's when he introduced me to this book called The Science of Art. And I'm going to show you what he explained to me in order to avoid this. How to avoid that problem is by making sure you've got the ground plane established as it goes out to the principal vanishing point. Mm-hmm. And you make a transition from this point up into the vertical planes.
If your trees are up here, you're going to need some more stuff, smaller, to get you back here.
You've got
showing.
Yes, you've got to show this.
You can't just stop here.
Yes, you can't just stop there and expect the eye to pick it up. You've got to actually make the transition. You've got to make the transition for the viewer from the ground plane up into the diagonal planes, up into the vertical planes. That's a mechanical thing that you've got to do with your perspective. If you can imagine your lines, railroad tracks, all coming up and converging on this point right back here, the transition from here up to here has to be clear, which it isn't now. You just got a plane like this and a plane like this. So that's the key. You've got to transition these planes clearly. You've got to show the viewer the undulation of the terrain and get your viewer from one plane to the next plane clearly. That's the only way to do it, with linear perspective. Carefully map it out. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Here's the photo right here. Eye view is somewhere up in here. And you can see that if you look carefully at the photo, we go from this plane to this plane to this plane to this plane to this plane, all undulating up, right? Mm-hmm. So when I got into the drawing part of it, I established my principal vanishing point right back here in the foothills. Now you notice there's no precipice here. From these trees to this tree, these trees, they just continue right on back, right on up the hill. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. So listen, intuition, in my opinion, is the basis of art, really, the intuitive. And a lot of artists tell me art should be as exclusively intuitive. I don't agree with that. I think we have two sides of the brain. One's the rational side, the other is the intuitive side. I want to integrate the two. When I was a young kid, I brought a group of artists up to Wilson Hurley's studio and arranged for a morning of painting with Wilson. And I don't know if you've ever met Wilson before, but he talked about everything under the sun except for how to paint. He never got to that point. And one of the students was very frustrated, a young guy, and he was wanting to learn how to paint so badly. And he raised his hand. He said, Mr. Hurley, we've been up here 2 hours, and all you've talked about is science and math and everything else and weather and except how to paint. Why is that? Hurley didn't take very well to that. And he looked at him and he said, I'll tell you why, young man. Because nobody ever made a better anything by being dumb. By the way, I have one goal in my life here with all of us, and that's to make better paintings, for you and for me both. You make better paintings, I make better paintings. Art is very, very subjective. There's a lot of artists who would totally disagree with me, and I don't disagree with that. I've done many abstract paintings, painted abstractly for many years, very loosely, and it's a joy, and there's nothing wrong with it. But for me, the longer I started, the longer I kept in painting, the more I wanted to see the natural world in a more realistic fashion.